Now, one of the cities that I always wanted to see, and which I saw in the monsoon season, I can only travel for a long time in July. It's the worst time to visit Calcutta. I do not visit Calcutta in July unless you like torrential rain. Some people do. They like it. They like torrential. If you like torrential rain and impossible heat, please visit Calcutta in July. So I saw it at its worst, which is good. I mean, that was very good in terms of my getting an insight. But then when the torrential rain stopped after 4 hours of torrenting, then the sun came out, and then you could go out and see the city, and it gave me a picture of how people live in the midst of all that water, because the city is like New Orleans. I never wanted to live in New Orleans. I always wanted to live in Manhattan because it's built on granite. New Orleans is built on mud. Yeah. What happens is the water comes down from the mountains and flows down and carries all this dirt. And then it dumps it at the mouth of the river and creates this muddy, swampy, got the picture? That's New Orleans, that's what it is. Well, you can get sick in New Orleans. All right. So this swampy, muddy delta, and then more of this dirt comes clump, clump, clump. And there's water and clump and water and clump. And it's all flat. Now, some people like living in a swamp. They do. They think it's mysterious, they think it's romantic, whatever. I like rock. But I want to tell you that if you want to understand Calcutta, you have to think of it as New Orleans. It's at the mouth of a river, and in fact, where it is now was open water centuries ago. It's just filling up with the dirt. It's like the Nile, right? Where Alexandria was. The Nile keeps pushing out the what? The land, just as the Mississippi kept pushing out the land, dumping all this dirt, or the Tigris and Euphrates. So Calcutta is in a place where it's very easy to catch a disease. I mean, it is at 22 degrees latitude. 22 degrees latitude is already in the Caribbean, all right? It's hot, hot, hot. It is in the months between March and July, it's impossible. You need at least 3 people to fan you. One here, one behind. And when the British were there, they what? They had at least 5 people to fan each Britisher. All right, so there they were. It is very, very hot. And it is very, very humid. And right now, it is very, very crowded. It is not a comfortable place. And in fact, when the British came there, and especially starting in March, it became impossible. In June, when the rains come, it cools off just slightly, not very much, but it's wet. Do you understand? And now you're in the midst of a swamp, so suddenly the water is running where? Through your legs, down the streets. It's all over the place. It's a little bit like New Orleans. And you can sometimes feel, when I'm in New Orleans, I always feel the thing's going to sink somewhere into the delta, into the swamp. 150 miles north, and what? You got gorgeous mountains, and you can now see the British pattern. When March arrived in April, the British weren't going to stay in swampy, humid, impossible Calcutta, were they? They now got their servants together, and they got into their carriages, and they went north to Charlevoix, to Petoskey. They went north to a place quite famous, Darjeeling. It's right on the edge of the Himalayas, and there they built their lodges, and they brought their servants, and they had their country homes and the whole thing, and they brought their children because they wouldn't want their children to breathe that terrible, the fumes of the miasma that was in Calcutta. So there they would stay, and then somewhere around October, September or October, they would come back. November to March is the best time to visit Calcutta, and then they were not really comfortable because it's still what? Incredibly and impossibly hot. So one of the big questions is, how could one of the greatest cities in the world, a city which at one time was the second largest city in the British Empire, how could such a city emerge in that place? Why? Why would anybody choose it? Now, in order to explain that, I have to talk about the first people who got there. The first people who lived there, and I do want to point out that the first people who came to live there lived along this river. It's one of the great rivers of the world. It is mispronounced in English, the Ganges. Well, it's an English word. But all over India, it's the most famous river of all. It's the Ganga. And in fact, it's a holy river. People bathe in the river now because they believe it has supernatural power. I looked at the river. I had no desire to bathe in it. I mean, I had no desire to bathe in it. But millions of people do, all right? And they swear that it has supernatural power. Now, the Ganga rises up in the Himalayas, not far from Nepal. And then it heads eastward, and then it makes a curve and heads down into what is called today the Bay of Bengal, which is part of the Indian Ocean. At the curve, another great river meets it. That river rises in the Himalayas too, but farther to the east. It's called the Brahmaputra, and it comes, meets the Ganga, and then together this joint stream, the Ganga and the Brahmaputra, empty out into the delta. So obviously, if you're living in a world in which the best form of transportation is by boat on a river, then whatever is at the mouth of that river is what? A great place. Now the delta, once you get to the delta, it's like New Orleans or the Nile. Because the dirt was just clumped in various places, there are many outlets to the river. There isn't one outlet. In fact, there's a main channel, a main outlet, which is the Ganga-Brahmaputra one. But often the current there is swift, so you've got all these others. One of the other outlets, which is important to us, is called the Hooghly. Hang on to that word. I mean, Shanghai in China is at the mouth of the Yangtze, of the Yangtze River. But it's not on the main outlet because the current there would be what? Too swift. It's on a river or an outlet just to the south of the main one because it's a delta, and you've got all this water streaming through all this mud. Now, the first people that came there were a dark-skinned people, very dark. In fact, we might call them black by our present standards. The name that they ultimately got from anthropologists, I'm not sure they call themselves by that name, is Dravidians. They are the base racial population of India. They were very dark, they had straight black hair, and they had high shoulders. And that race is to be found all over India, and they settled down there, and they engaged in agriculture. They ultimately found, that's what happens, it's like the Tigris and Euphrates, that dirt, or the Nile, that dirt at the delta is fertile. That's great to grow what? Anything in. So the reason why people settle down there in that miasma is because they don't have supermarkets. So if you have a supermarket, you go find a nice hill. Or you can move to a desert like Arizona where you can't grow anything, right? And then you can buy everything in the store. But if you have to grow your own food, you better find a place where you can grow food easily. So that's where they settle down in this impossible place, because you have to understand that if the monsoons come, this torrential rain, this area is often, and we read about it every single year. I mean, the disasters, they're flooded. I mean, the water just rushes over your village, drowns your family. But the appeal of the area was too great, and the people settled down there, and they began their agriculture. It's a wonderful place for the cultivation of rice. I mean, you can understand with all that water, and so you have a kind of base food, and the people were there. And because life was very, very hard, they did not view nature as friendly. So if you're in Hawaii, you would develop a religion where what? The gods were friendly. You're lying on Waikiki, the whole thing. So the gods are friendly, aren't they? But if you live in that place, nature is not friendly. Nature is floods, and nature is disaster, and nature can take away your family in what? In a moment. And every year you read about these terrible torrential monsoon floods that fill the area, and thousands of people die, and we don't even notice it, do we? I mean, it's one of those statistics on television. So their view of the gods was that the gods were angry. One of the great gods of India comes from the Dravidians. His name is Shiva. And he's often called Shiva the Destroyer. He has many arms, and he's angry. And you better what? Be good to him, because if you're not good to him, you're going to get a flood. You're going to get a fire. You're going to get a disaster. He's out to get you. And he had a wife, a wonderful woman. You see her often. She has 10 arms, and her tongue is hanging out, and she has snakes around her neck. Real friendly type. Her name is Kali. People who follow her, of course, are Kali followers, don't they? But Kali has many names. One of her other names, which appears in the area, is Durga. And Kali is the wife, and she is also fearsome, and she is a goddess of fertility, but she is also a goddess of what? Destruction. So you better give her what she wants. And in fact, the people did. Now, hang on to the word Kali, because if you want to understand where the word Calcutta comes from, there it is. One of her great temples was right near that area at the mouth of the Ganga. It was called Kalighat. If you say Kalighat, the way the English pronounce things, you ultimately get Calcutta. All right. So hang on to Kali, and in fact the symbol of Kali is very important, because if you're a tourist, a very good time to go to Calcutta is in September and October. It's still the edge of the monsoon season, but it's the beginning of the nice weather. And they have the great Durga Puja, which is the great parade. The whole city is Christmas. It's Christmas, Easter, it's everything together. Thousands of people come out into the streets. Animals are sacrificed. She has a big appetite. And there the picture of Kali. All right, so the great Durga Puja. So hang on to her, because she remains an integral part of this city. And she, as a goddess, is a symbol of the problem of Calcutta. It is not an easy, do you understand? It's not an easy place to live in. The reason you'd be there is because you can grow food or you can make money. It's not because you want a vacation. Although if you're a tourist, you'd want to what? Stop by for a short while to see where people made money and grew food. Now, into the world of the Dravidians came invaders, and that's why you see different shades of black and white in Calcutta. The invaders came from Eastern Europe, moved into Central Asia, came down across the Himalayas. They were called, or are called by anthropologists. I don't think they call themselves by that name, but they were called by anthropologists Aryans. They are the original Aryan people. They were white, and they worshiped gods of the sky, and their great source of food was not vegetables or grain, it was cows. And it was from them that the worship of the cow and of cattle came into India. The great Aryans came down, and they conquered all of northern India, and in fact the name India comes from them because ultimately they took a name called the Hindi. And the Hindi people occupied two river valleys, one to the west of the Ganga called the Indus, and one to the east, which indeed is the Ganga Brahmaputra, and they settled down, and then over a period of centuries they pushed their way south until they reached the very tip of India. Along the way, they subdued and conquered these black people. And what then emerged, of course, is what emerged in Latin America when the Spanish arrived. The English, when they arrived, solved their problem. They exterminated most of the Indians. That solved the problem, right? But obviously, the Aryans were smarter because they wanted to use these people for labor. So they kept them, and in the end, sexual relations take place. Rape, pillage, whatever, and out of that emerged various shades of black, brown, and white, which now characterize Indian society. And because the whites who conquered India were racists, they established a racial system which still prevails in India. In fact, the political party that just organized the government in India was organized by upper caste Hindus and built on an old racial principle that has been around for a long, long time. The whiter you are, the what? The higher you are, the darker you are, the lower you are, and that caste system was now established and reinforced by a group of Aryans who called themselves the priests of the gods. They're called the Brahmins, and the Brahmin priests made sure that everybody had a classification according to color. And today, if you go to Calcutta or other parts of India, people are interested in your caste. Officially, the Indian Constitution forbids caste. But on a practical level, it what? It operates in everyday life. People do not mind marrying up, but they certainly don't want to marry down. That principle even applies to the United States, to the United States of America. Now, the Aryans brought with them a language. It's related to Persian, it's related to German, it's related to English, it's called Sanskrit. And everybody spoke Sanskrit. In time, is what happened to Latin. Latin turned into French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, because people in different areas speak the language differently. Ultimately, the same thing happened in India or Hindi land, and you now had different kinds of Sanskrit. Over here, you had Marathi, and then you had what is called Hindi, and then you have Bihari or Pali, and then at the mouth of the Ganga, there developed a branch of Sanskrit which defined the area. And the people who live there often identify themselves by the name of their language. They are called Bengalis. And the language they speak is not Sanskrit. I mean, Spanish is not Latin. It's from Latin, but it's what? It's Spanish. French is not Latin. It's from Latin, but it's what? It's French. And in fact, if you are a Marathi living near Bombay, you'll have difficulty understanding a Bengali who lives in Calcutta. But they're now emerged, going back over 2,000 years, a people. They are a nation. And they viewed themselves in some way as a nation. They are the Bengalis. In fact, if you go to London today, and if you look at most of the Indian immigrants that are there on the East End, they are that's what they are. They are Bengalis. And the language they speak is Bengali. The word India is more now of a geographic term rather than a term describing distinct nations, because the Bengalis are a nation. And the word Bengal, I mean, every fifth movie made in Hollywood had the Bengal what? The Lancers or something. So that's it. The area that's at the mouth of the Ganga, Brahmaputra, is Bengal. The people who live there are the Bengalis, and the language they speak is derived from Sanskrit, and they're a mixture of the white and the dark. Actually, the Aryans, the whites, did not settle in large numbers in this area, so Bengal tends to be a little darker than areas that are farther to the west, resembling in many cases areas that are farther to the south in India. So let me tell you a little bit about the Bengalis. Very early in their history, they developed a professional profile. They are at the mouth of a river. Mouths of rivers are good for commerce, right? You bring everything down the river, and then other boats or ships can carry it to other places. So very early in their history, we're not quite sure when, the Bengalis became good at commerce and trade. In fact, they always, if you are in Calcutta, Bengalis look down on Biharis. Biharis are further up the river. They think of Biharis like country bumpkins. They're farmers, basically, do you understand? Most Bengalis are farmers, but the attitude of the Bengalis is one of people who are in the middle class or the bourgeoisie in some cases, and very early they developed a professional profile. They were engaged in commerce. And along the way, because they were engaged in commerce and were not passive peasants, they developed a sense of resistance to the Aryans. And therefore, there were various movements that came through the Bengal that are part of Calcutta that express the resistance of the people of the area to the system established by the Aryans. There are two religions that have their place in Calcutta. One, or an old Bengal, one is Buddhism, which was established in the 6th century BC, was led by the bourgeoisie, and basically opposed the caste system. And in fact, if you understand, Buddhism doesn't exist very much in India anymore, but it passed down into Indochina, into what, Burma and Thailand and so forth. And so the root of it was where? It was right through this area, and in fact, Bengal was a transmitter of it. The other is a religion which is now building a temple of its own on 12 Mile between Inkster and Middlebelt. It's called the Jain Temple, Jain. And the Jainists also were a religion that broke away from Hinduism. They broke away from Hinduism on the issue of caste. And today, one of the great millionaires, the Rockefeller of Calcutta for years, Mr. Birla, B-I-R-L-A, who was the king of automobiles. That is not Hindu, that is Jainist. But the main thing that defined both the triumph and the agony of Bengal was that in the 12th century, the Muslims arrived. The first Muslims arrived in the 8th and 9th century. They were Arabs, but they had overextended themselves and they weren't able to enter. But then the Turks were converted to Islam. and they had the energy to invade India. And in the 12th century, they swept through India. And they conquered almost all of it, including Bengal. And they were Muslims. And in fact, they created a capital. They unified almost all of India, and they created a city which became the symbol of Muslim control of India. It's called Delhi, D-E-L-H-I. It's right there in the north middle, on the way from Turkland, if you will, Turkestan, down into India. And there, the Turkish Sultan ruled. And then he made an offer. The people he had conquered were now overwhelmingly Hindu. He had only a small band of Muslims. How was he going to control the area? And he said the following: if you convert to Islam, then you will not be at the bottom, you'll be at the top. If you are at the lowest level of the caste system, do you understand? The very bottom. If you convert to Islam, you'll go from the what? The very bottom to the top. Oh. Fairly attractive, right? Oh. So, thousands and thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of Hindus who were in the lower castes converted to Islam. And by so doing, they left the caste system, right? They now joined the conquerors. Well, one of the areas where the conversion program was most successful was Bengal. And that is why today you can see Bengal's divided. There's a Muslim Bengal, which is a separate country called Bangladesh, and there is a Hindu Bengal where the city of Calcutta is to be found. But for centuries there was no division. Bengal was a place where Hindus and Muslims lived together. They didn't necessarily like each other. The Muslims bore resentment toward the Hindus, which was more than religious. It was centuries of what? Persecution as lower caste people. And the Hindus bore hostility to the Muslims because every time you pinched a Hindu, he said, oh, those Muslims, they're nothing but lower caste, what? Refugees, they're nothing. But in the end, the division was there, and that was to produce a tension which you would find in Calcutta. That tension existed in Calcutta certainly until 1948 and was to remain a part of the area because Calcutta is not far from a Muslim country called today Bangladesh, which, as you can see, comes from the word Bengali. Now, in time, the Turkish control of India, and the last Turkish dynasty was called the Mughals. And they ruled from Delhi. And they divided up their place into sub-kingdoms or provinces. Each one ruled either by a Raja or the word that was used by them, a Nawab. Now, the British couldn't pronounce Nawab, so they made it Nabob. And we get that word, remember the Nabobs, all right? So the British did that, you know, they got Galigot became Calcutta and Nawab became Nabob, but we all understand. We all do that when we travel, don't we? So there was a Nawab of Uttar Pradesh, there was a Nawab of Bengal. And in fact, the whole mouth of the river, including the temple to Kali, Kaligat, was what? Under the Nawab of Bengal, who was responsible to the Mughal emperor who was in Delhi. And then one day, Vasco da Gama made his way around the bottom of Africa. 1498, and he reached India. And now the Europeans had arrived. And between 1498 and 1690, the year in which Calcutta was created, See, I'm telling you a story in which Calcutta is a new city. Did the people who became part of Calcutta live there for centuries? Yes, they've been there. Was Kali worshipped? Yes. Was there a temple called Kali God? What? Yes. Was there trade and commerce in that area, in the very spot? Yes. Was there a specific city called Calcutta? I haven't given you that yet, have I?